July 10, 1940. The English Channel, near Dover. A formation of German Junkers Ju-87 Stuka dive bombers, their distinctive inverted gull wings silhouetted against the hazy sky, begins its descent towards a British convoy. The lead pilot focuses on the ship below, the familiar scream of his siren beginning to pierce the air. His cockpit is a bubble of focused calm, his attention fixed downward on the target. He has no reason to look behind. German fighter screens and established doctrine have conditioned him to expect threats from above or the flanks. Suddenly, tracers rip past his canopy from a blind spot directly astern. The explosive crack of cannon shells striking his aircraft is the first and last warning. A Royal Air Force Bristol Beaufighter, having approached from low and behind, using the sea and the enemy's own tactical blind faith as cover, unleashes a point-blank volley. The Stuka, never designed to defend against an assault from its 6 o'clock low, disintegrates. This was not an anomaly, it was a calculated shock, a deliberate rupture of the Luftwaffe's core expectations. To understand the profound shock of a British attack from the rear, one must first appreciate the absolute confidence of the Luftwaffe in the summer of 1940. This was an air force forged in the crucible of the Blitzkrieg, a doctrine of war that emphasized speed, concentration, and overwhelming offensive power. Theirs was a tactical worldview built on the axiom of the unstoppable forward thrust. In Poland, Norway, and France, the Junkers Ju-87 Stuka had been not just a bomber, but a psychological weapon. Its near-vertical dive and terrifying siren became the soundtrack of German advance, a symbol of precision and invulnerability. German fighter pilots, flying the agile Messerschmitt Bf 109, were trained in high-side attacks and boom-and-zoom tactics, engaging from positions of altitude and energy advantage. The entire Luftwaffe command structure, from Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring down to the junior squadron leaders, operated on a foundation of accrued success. They had developed a winning formula, and in their minds, the Battle of Britain was to be its final, decisive application. The enemy was expected to react, not to act in a fundamentally unpredictable way. This operational dogma created a significant blind spot, one rooted in both technology and psychology. German bomber formations were designed for mutual protection, with gunners covering arcs to the sides, above, and below. The rear, however, was often the most lightly defended sector, especially in aircraft like the Stuka, which had a single rear-facing machine gun. The assumption was simple: a fighter would not be able to position itself directly behind a formation for a sustained, lethal attack without being detected and destroyed by the escorting Messerschmitts. This was not seen as a vulnerability, but as an accepted parameter of aerial combat. Intelligence reports and pre-war assessments had not prepared them for the unique combination of technology, training, and sheer audacity that the Royal Air Force would bring to the fight. The Luftwaffe expected a battle of attrition fought on their terms. They were not prepared for a battle of wits that would systematically dismantle their core assumptions. For Britain, the spring and summer of 1940 represented a starkly different reality. While the Luftwaffe planned its next offensive from a position of strength, the Royal Air Force Fighter Command was recovering from the disaster at Dunkirk and preparing for a battle it was not certain it could win. The fall of France meant Britain stood alone, its coastline now the front line. The strategic situation was desperate. Every aircraft, every pilot, was a precious and irreplaceable asset. The margin for error was zero. This desperation became the mother of invention. The RAF could not afford to engage the Luftwaffe in a classic, turning dogfight on the enemy's terms. The numerical odds were simply too great. They needed to maximize the lethality of every engagement, to make every interception count. This required a fundamental re-evaluation of tactics, technology, and the very psychology of air combat. The British were not bound by a victorious doctrine, they were liberated by the necessity of survival. This environment of necessity fostered a culture of rapid adaptation. Key figures emerged, such as Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, head of Fighter Command, a pragmatic and technologically minded leader who understood that Britain's salvation lay in an integrated system of defense, not just the bravery of its pilots. This system, which would become known as the Dowding system, wove together radar, ground observers, radio control, and sector stations into a single, cohesive network. It was this system that allowed the RAF to manage its scarce resources so efficiently. It meant that British fighters were not wasted on endless patrols, but were instead scrambled with precise vectoring to intercept incoming raids. This strategic-level innovation trickled down to the tactical. Squadron leaders, many of them veterans of the fighting over France, began to question old playbooks. They realized that breaking up large, unwieldy three-plane VIC formations and experimenting with more flexible, four-plane units could offer advantages. The focus shifted from rigid drills to achieving a single, decisive firing pass. The stage was being set for a profound tactical shock, born from British desperation and systematic planning, aimed directly at the heart of German aerial confidence. The prevailing Luftwaffe fighter doctrine, the Dictabulk, emphasized securing advantages of sun, altitude, and speed before attacking. It was a philosophy of controlled, slashing assaults. For bomber crews, this translated to a tactical worldview where threats were managed forward. Escorting Bf-109s flew high cover, scanning the skies ahead and above. Rear protection was often an afterthought, a sector covered by a single, often less experienced, gunner. The entire German system was engineered to spot an enemy turning into an engagement, not one already positioned in the dead zone. British pilots, by contrast, were increasingly drilled on the concept of the no-sight attack. If the enemy was not looking at you, he could not shoot back. This simple, brutal logic overturned chivalrous notions of aerial combat. The goal was not to prove superiority in a turning fight, but to achieve a kill in the first, surprise pass. This doctrinal schism, honed duel versus ambush, meant British pilots sought the blind spot German doctrine had inadvertently created. The British technological advantage was not in the fighter's guns, but in the ground-based radar that directed it. The chain-home network, a string of towering radio transmitter masts along the British coast, provided the crucial early warning. But it was the smaller, more precise chain-home low stations that could detect low-flying aircraft. This integrated system gave fighter command an unparalleled god's-eye view. Controllers in sector operations rooms could see the German formations forming over France, plot their course across the Channel, and then vector British fighters with cold efficiency. They were not sent to patrol, they were placed. This allowed RAF squadrons to maneuver into a position of supreme tactical advantage, often down sun and low, using the glare of the sun and the clutter of the ground or sea to mask their approach. The radar was the great enabler, turning the sky into a chessboard where the British player could see several moves ahead, positioning his pieces for a strike from an unexpected angle the German player had not even considered. While German pilot training was extensive, it was also standardized around the offensive sweep and the bomber interception profile. The rear attack was not a core component because it was not considered a primary threat vector. In Britain, however, the rapid influx of new pilots from the Commonwealth and Allied nations necessitated a streamlined, focused training regimen. The emphasis was on gun harmonization, converging the fire of 8.303 Browning machine guns at a specific range, often 250 yards, and a single, devastating firing pass. Pilots were taught to avoid turning with the more agile Bf-109 and to use their robust aircraft, like the Hurricane, as stable gun platforms. This training fostered a marksman's mentality. The ideal engagement was not a prolonged dogfight, but a single, well-aimed burst into a vulnerable part of an unsuspecting enemy. The cockpit drill was one of patience and discipline. Hold formation, follow the vector, let the controller put you in position, and then strike from the one place the enemy was not looking. It was a methodical process that turned novice pilots into effective ambushers. Executing a rear attack required a specific, cold form of courage. It was not the flamboyant bravery of the duelist, but the nerve of the hunter stalking its prey. A pilot had to hold his course, often for agonizing seconds, as his aircraft closed the distance from behind. He was flying directly into the defensive fire of the enemy formation, however limited it might be. Every instinct screamed to break away, to evade, to jink. But success depended on absolute steadiness. The pilot had to ignore the tracers likely beginning to flick towards him from the enemy gunners, keep his aircraft perfectly level, and focus entirely on his gun sight. He had to trust that his leader's navigation and the ground controller's vectoring had been flawless, placing him in this lethal sweet spot. This was a test of discipline over adrenaline. It was the courage to be patient, to wait until the enemy filled his windscreen, to absorb the incoming fire for those final, critical moments to ensure his own burst was accurate and lethal. This psychological fortitude, to press the attack from a position that felt exposed and unnatural, was the human element that made the tactic devastating. The success of the rear attack was often sealed by a layer of tactical deception. British squadrons became adept at using the environment to mask their final approach. The most common tool was the attack out of the sun, using solar glare to blind German lookouts. But more sophisticated deceptions involved layered formations. One squadron might engage the German escort fighters at a higher altitude, drawing the Bf-109s away and up, while a second squadron, positioned lower and unseen, would then climb to strike the now undefended bombers from behind. Another method involved using cloud cover not just for concealment, but as a navigational aid. Pilots would fly on instruments within a cloud bank, emerge at a pre-calculated position and altitude, and find the enemy formation perfectly silhouetted ahead and below, with no warning given. This application of misdirection turned the sky itself into a weapon. The Luftwaffe, expecting a direct, head-on challenge to their air superiority, was instead confounded by a series of feints and strikes from unseen quarters, systematically dismantling their confidence and their defensive cohesion. The true turning point was not a single, calendar-marked day, but a cumulative shift in the fabric of the air war throughout August and September 1940. The tactic of the rear attack evolved from a sporadic, desperate measure into a standardized, battle-winning procedure. Its implementation was methodical. RAF controllers, their maps strewn with markers representing incoming raids, began to specifically vector squadrons to achieve a stern conversion. Fighters were guided not to a head-on intercept, but to a point in space behind and often slightly below the German formations. The pilots would then execute a steady, unseen climb, the throbbing Rolls-Royce Merlin engines pushing them into the bomber stream's most vulnerable quarter. For the Luftwaffe bomber crews, the first indication of this new reality was often the sound of their own aircraft being torn apart. The rattle of machine guns and the deeper thud of cannon fire were not preceded by the visual warning of an approaching fighter. It was death arriving unseen. The psychological impact was immediate and corrosive. A sense of invulnerability was replaced by a creeping paranoia. Gunners now strained to scan an empty-looking rear hemisphere, their nerves fraying with the constant, terrifying possibility of an attack that gave no warning. This shift in tactical fortune was starkly evident during the critical battles of mid to late August. As the Luftwaffe intensified its attacks on RAF airfields, the need for efficient, lethal interceptions became absolute. On August 18, a day that would become known as the hardest day, the efficacy of the British tactics was seared into the experience of both sides. As large formations of WWII Stukas and Dornier Do-17s crossed the coast, they were met by Hurricanes and Spitfires that did not always challenge the high-flying escorts. Instead, using detailed ground control, they slipped into the blind spots. A Hurricane squadron, diving from altitude, might engage the Messerschmitts to occupy them, while another, climbing from below, would settle unseen behind the bombers. The Stuka, slow and vulnerable, suffered devastating losses. Its rear-facing gun was utterly inadequate against the 8-gun broadside of a Hurricane that had closed to near point-blank range from directly behind. The myth of the Stuka's invincibility was shattered not by a heroic, visible duel, but by a clinical, almost surgical, application of force from its least defended angle. By early September 1940, the tactical shock had matured into a strategic crisis for the Luftwaffe. The rear attack was no longer an anomaly. It was an expected, yet largely unavoidable, component of every deep penetration into British airspace. German bomber crews developed a palpable sense of dread during the return leg of their missions, a period when fatigue set in and fighter escort coverage often thinned. It was in these moments that the British fighters seemed to materialize most frequently from the rear, capitalizing on lowered vigilance. The psychological erosion was as critical as the material losses. Luftwaffe post-mission reports began to consistently note attacks originating from the 6 o'clock low position, a phrase that transformed from a tactical observation into a symbol of vulnerability. This forced a reactive, and ultimately flawed, shift in German tactics. Bomber formations were tightened, and escort fighters were ordered to fly closer, more rigid screens. This, however, played into fighter command's hands. The tighter formations reduced the bombers' maneuverability and made them even more susceptible to a concentrated rear assault, while also tying the hands of the agile Bf 109 pilots, who sacrificed their own tactical initiative to cling closer to their charges. The culmination of this pressure cooker environment was the decisive day of September 15. As two massive German raids converged on London, they were met with a perfectly coordinated series of interceptions built upon the now-perfected doctrine. The 1st RAF squadrons engaged the high escorts, drawing them into dogfights that depleted their fuel and ammunition. Then, fresh squadrons, held in reserve by Dowding's masterful management, were vectored into the now-exposed bomber streams. The ensuing battles were not the classic, swirling dogfights of legend, but a series of brutal, decisive strikes. Time and again, sections of Hurricanes and Spitfires were guided into the blind spots of the Dornier and Heinkel formations. They delivered their lethal fire from point-blank range, breaking the cohesion of the raids and forcing bombers to jettison their loads prematurely. The sky over southern England was scarred by the trails of dying aircraft, a majority of which had been dispatched by attacks they never saw coming. This day, which marked the undeniable failure of the Luftwaffe's campaign to achieve air superiority, was a testament not to a single heroic act, but to the systematic and relentless application of a tactical innovation the Axis command had never truly believed possible. The immediate consequence was a tangible shift in the air over southern England. Luftwaffe losses, particularly among the medium bombers like the Dornier Do-17 and Heinkel He-111, became unsustainable. Crews who had once flown with confident aggression now exhibited what German post-mission reports cautiously termed as excessive caution and low morale. The psychological security of the tight formation had been shattered. A gunner, once confident in the mutual protection of his flock, now knew that the greatest threat was the one he was least likely to see. This anxiety directly impacted operational effectiveness. Bombing accuracy declined as pilots began to take evasive action at the first sign of threat, real or imagined. The rear attack tactic had effectively degraded the offensive power of the entire German bomber force, not just by shooting down aircraft, but by corroding the nerve of the men inside them. The Luftwaffe was forced into a reactive posture, a stark contrast to the confident, offensive juggernaut of weeks prior. The initiative, so decisively held by the Axis in the summer, had now firmly passed to the defenders. This tactical victory yielded critical strategic breathing space for Britain. The failure of the Luftwaffe to establish air superiority by mid-September led directly to the indefinite postponement of Operation Sea Lion, the planned German invasion. Every bomber shot down in a fiery trail over Kent was a soldier who would not land on the beaches of Sussex. The relentless attrition inflicted by the RAF's methods allowed British industry to recover and rebuild. Damaged airfields were repaired, and new aircraft, rolling out of shadow factories, replaced those lost. Most importantly, the pilot training pipeline, though strained, was no longer being drained at a catastrophic rate. The rear attack, and the integrated system that enabled it, had bought Britain the most precious commodity of all time. This period solidified the Dowding system as the bedrock of British air defence and validated the costly, but essential, shift in combat tactics that had been forced upon the squadrons. The battle was not yet over, but its character had irrevocably changed from a desperate defence to a sustained, grinding war of attrition that the Luftwaffe was ill-prepared to win. Within the Luftwaffe High Command, the failure to counter the British tactics sparked a period of intense, and often bitter, reassessment. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring's initial bluster, blaming the fighter pilots for a lack of aggression, rang hollow in the face of consistent combat reports. The core of the problem was doctrinal. The Jagdflieger had been trained for one type of war and were now fighting another. A tacit acknowledgement of the new reality emerged in the form of new, often contradictory, orders. Escort fighters were instructed to fly closer, tighter screens, which in turn made them less effective and more vulnerable. There were urgent, though ultimately slow-moving, demands for bombers with heavier defensive armaments. The Messerschmitt Bf 110 heavy fighter, initially conceived as a long-range destroyer, was proven woefully vulnerable to the nimble British fighters and was reassigned to the role of fighter bomber, a testament to the loss of the Luftwaffe's ability to operate with impunity in British skies. The confidence of the force was broken. The technological and tactical surprise achieved by the RAF created a crisis of faith from which the German Air Force never fully recovered during the battle. They were no longer the masters of the air war, but a force being dictated to by an enemy they had profoundly underestimated. The long-term strategic implications extended far beyond the English Channel. The successful British defence, hinging on tactical innovations like the rear attack, ensured that the United Kingdom remained an unconquered bastion and a future springboard for the Allied return to Europe. It preserved the vital Atlantic lifeline and allowed for the continued, and eventually overwhelming, flow of American material under Lend-Lease. The battle also provided a devastatingly effective blueprint for aerial defense. The lessons of integrated radar, ground control, and specifically targeted tactical doctrines were studied intently by Allied air forces, and would later be used against Germany itself as the air war shifted to one of strategic bombing. The Luftwaffe, which had entered the battle believing its methods were unassailable, was forced onto the defensive. The shock of being attacked from behind, both literally and strategically, marked the beginning of a long, slow decline for an air force that had once seemed invincible. The failure to subdue Britain was the Third Reich's first major strategic setback, a failure made possible by a tactical surprise that targeted not just aircraft, but the very mindset of its commanders. The Battle of Britain endures in history not merely as a clash of aircraft, but as a profound lesson in the nature of conflict itself. It demonstrated that victory is not always secured by the larger force or the more aggressive doctrine, but by the ability to adapt, to think beyond established conventions, and to weaponize an enemy's assumptions. The German Air Command never expected an attack from behind because their entire framework of war, built on swift, forward-moving conquest, could not conceptualize it. They were defeated by a reality they had deemed impossible. The British response, a synthesis of technology, unorthodox tactics, and resilient courage, stands as a timeless testament to how innovation, born from necessity, can shatter the foundations of conventional power. It was a victory of intellect over inertia, of perception over presumption, ensuring that the light of freedom, however flickering, was never extinguished. The rear attack was more than a maneuver, it was a statement that in the face of overwhelming force, the human capacity to rethink, to adapt, and to strike from an unexpected quarter can alter the course of history.